you have these things that happen, just in human history. You've had things like Newton and Leibniz discovering calculus at the same time, and things like that, where they're seemingly disconnected people discovering the same ideas at the same time. And I think that's akin to what your brain does when it comes up with ideas. It's not necessarily like one brain cell is this genius brain cell and it teaches that idea to all the rest of your brain. It's like your brain kind of emergently comes up with the idea.
You are tuning in to the Multiversity, a podcast for higher dimensional education.
Join us as we explore philosophy, science, history, and the great unknown.
Okay, welcome everyone to our second episode on battling the meaning crisis. Today we have something very special planned for you. We are going to solve the meaning crisis or die trying. I'm Ariel, and I'm very excited for what we're going to do today.
I'm Katie, and I need some more meaning in my life, so this is great.
I'm Chris, and I'm a warrior for meaning.
I'm Kurt, and I just love meaning.
Meaning. Who needs it? Turns out a lot of us do. See, in the past, great civilizations came with default worldviews, which provided sets of belief. In China, this was Confucianism. In India, Hinduism, and in the West, Christianity. These worldviews caused problems, for sure, but they also unified society and gave people a sense of meaning in their lives. But with the Enlightenment and modernity, these worldviews were called into question, and today, fewer and fewer people live within them. Instead, more and more of us are unsure what to believe. We may feel anxious, depressed, lost, or apathetic. We might respond to the meaning crisis by turning to dogmatism and engaging in dramatic ideological battles. Or we may turn to nihilism, the rejection of all meaning. The four of us have gone through the first 19 episodes of John Vervaeke's course, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which we highly recommend. We're going to draw from that course and come up with ideas on how to solve the meaning crisis. So we're going to have a brainstorm session. Solutions to the meaning crisis. We're going to try to come up with as many as possible. Crazy ideas, non-crazy ideas, specific ideas, non-specific ideas, and I'm trying to come up with as much as possible. So these ideas don't necessarily represent who you are and what you truly believe. We're just trying to build out the landscape a bit. So let's go. So I can start. One idea for solving the meaning crisis is forcing everyone to become Christian again.
Yeah.
So we're just going to come up with ideas and then we'll critique them later. Is that what you said?
Yes.
All right. Force everyone to become Buddhist.
I'd suggest mindfulness classes in primary school.
I suggest the government becomes officially New Age, and once a week, all TV and radio stations broadcast mandatory meditations and philosophical readings.
Okay.
I think we should link all of our brains together so that we become a hive mind.
You could genetically engineer everyone to be way smarter.
Encourage children to research at least 5 spiritual traditions.
That's an actually good idea. I think we should have something like meaning meetup groups, or I don't want to say meetup groups, but like centers that are common, that serve both like philosophical roles where you listen to a presentation, then everybody kind of openly discusses ideas, but also it's like there's food there and it's kind of a community center. Maybe it's a library. You get your daycare for free. There's events and stuff like that. Like churches without set beliefs. I know those kind of already exist, but
I don't know if you guys have ever been to a Quaker meeting, but what the Quakers do, they just sit in silence for an hour, and if somebody feels like speaking, then they'll get up and speak. And if they're angry or if they're passionate or whatever it is, they'll speak their heart. So that's an interesting practice, and that could be incorporated into a society.
Yeah, I've heard of that, and I really like how it sounds. I think that, and I think maybe Vervaeke would agree with me on this, that some kind of careful use of psychedelics, sort of guided use of psychedelics, might be really constructive and healing.
LSD in the water supply.
Yeah.
So
I was gonna say a lot of the issue is that I don't think it's so much about what people do. Like there's a lot of different paths. It's about galvanizing people in our culture to seek that out. So I mean, things in schools or like if celebrities were talking about purpose and meaning in life, and if that was more normalized, that seeking out your purpose was something that we should be doing and seeking meaning was something that we should be doing, and we were talking about all these different ideas, I think that would be the biggest thing. Celebrity meaning campaign.
Yeah, get the top social media influencers to push some spiritual stuff.
Yeah, but and like not only spirituality, but like there's so many books and shows and podcasts out there that are about like self-improvement and how to be like your most productive and how to be your, I don't know, like I think of people like Tim Ferriss or all these business leaders or like impact theory that I kind of show. Impact theory is more about that, but there's a lot of like optimize yourself, but not a whole lot of like for what.
So there needs to be more of a purpose.
Yeah. It's a cultural problem. We need the idea of purpose imbued in the culture. So
government sponsored ayahuasca.
The suspension of society-wide use of the scientific method in order to encourage belief in the supernatural.
That's a can of worms.
you know, they say cans of worms kill the cat. Be careful.
There's the Unabomber idea, take down civilization basically so that people have challenge in their lives again.
Yeah, down with civilization. You know, let's just. I like the woods. I think we should all go live in the woods.
Yeah, send people off to the woods for a rite of passage so they have to survive for 40 days and learn what life is really about by killing snakes and stuff.
Could be figures like Diogenes walking around who are trying to like spark realizations in people by confronting them in shocking ways.
Here's a question. Do we feel like we've solved it personally for ourselves?
I feel like I'm in a better place than I was. I feel like life is basically probably just a big meaning crisis or like it's just, you know, maybe sometimes you feel like you have meaning and then other times you're like, whoa, where did the meaning go? And then it's kind of a wave, I would say. But I do feel like I have more meaning now than I used to.
Okay. Well, okay.
That's
Solve our own personal meaning crisis so that we can take on wider and wider.
Two things. You brought up Jordan Peterson. I think he has a good idea, which is encourage people to take on more personal responsibility. And the other thing is, when I was a kid, I was in Boy Scouts, and I think that influenced me in a positive direction because it taught me the value of having personal responsibility, taking care of myself. And it also encouraged me to go outside and connect with nature. And I think both of those things are probably useful for achieving a higher sense of meaning.
You're reconnecting with nature.
Conscription. Bringing back conscription. Everyone has to be in the army for a bit.
Yeah, conscription into the national park rangers. I was gonna say
You must be a park ranger for 4 years.
Yeah,
I love it.
Connect with nature. Let people know that existential crises, regular existential crises, are actually a healthy part of life.
Yeah, just more wise people and more exposure of people who are wise.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, what about the Stoics idea, like training people to separate events from the meanings that we put on the events?
Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Start a charity to put TV commercials on and are just like 30-second nuggets of wisdom.
That's a good idea.
Encourage people to get off the hamster wheel and go look for meaning, because you're not going to find meaning just go into your job week in, week out, month in, month out. You really got to look deep inside, and you need time. You need free time to be able to do that. Oh,
Could that be a proposal for UBI?
Yeah.
I was going to bring up Vervaeke's idea, or maybe he got it from somebody else, but this idea of modal confusion, which I think connects to conflating events with the meaning of the events. But we have this kind of being mode and this having mode. And so we think that the having mode is going to bring us, is going to improve our being mode somehow, but it just takes us further away from that. So we're modally confused. Actually, that's a problem. I don't know what the solution to that would be. Maybe just less advertising, less commoditization.
I think some kind of a philosophy, psychology, cognitive science, and like meaning class should be as standard of a part of the curriculum as history and math and all those things. Like there are certain subjects that you take in school every year, and I think that like knowing thyself or something, I don't know what you would call the course, but should be part of it.
Yeah, actually, I went to Catholic school, and you had to have theology all 4 years, but the second year of theology was basically philosophy and mindfulness. And I think, that was really useful.
I like these different models of schooling, like with unschooling. There's also this, I don't know what they call it, free schooling or something, where the students set their own curriculum, like they explain, this is what I'm going to learn, or this is what I'm going to accomplish. And then the teachers help them facilitate that.
I'd say, as a proposal, figuring out as a civilization what meaning is before we can have all these pedagogical systems.
Or at least come to a consensus about what meaning is. Maybe not find out objectively what it is, but at least something that we can all agree on.
Maybe. Okay.
Long-term goal setting, like being kind of standard. I'm thinking about things that can be done in public schools because that's where most people go and where most people are impacted, but maybe some kind of independent projects starting from a younger age, like age 11, 12, 13, that would go over the course of a year.
And the Fed.
Have everybody join extreme ideological camps, then go to war.
With other ideological camps.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just have all the ideologues just kill each other off.
Everyone can be an ideologue going to war. It feels very meaningful, I'm sure.
Have everybody be brainwashed into some kind of ideological cult with like love bombing and the full thing, and then after like 2 years tell them that it was all a hoax to brainwash them and teach them like the true meaning of how they can be manipulated.
It would be for vendetta, but for everyone.
Figure out how to give everybody superpowers and then get them all to fight each other. Okay, do we have more, or are we
good.
I think that's enough. Yeah.
I think we came
Okay.
up with some good solutions.
Yeah, this is great. So, okay, guys, let's go through some of these and figure out how we're going to solve this meaning crisis. So, for starters, should we force everyone to become Christian again? Or let's make it a little bit general. Should we force everyone to become a specific religion, like Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, some religion?
So I think the answer is no, for pretty clear ethical reasons, hopefully. But it does, like, if we are willing to follow this thought experiment and go down that role, like, I mean, it would probably solve the meaning crisis in some ways for people who actually took to the religion.
Maybe there would be some group who would actually want to found their own society on religious principles, and they could do it without it being mandatory. They do it voluntarily, and maybe that would help their community.
Yeah, I think the clearly unethical part of this solution is the force part. You want people to be able to freely choose their spiritual path. And so I think the solution is something a lot more like come up with a religion that everybody can agree on.
I think in order to get everybody to agree on the same religion, we would have to go backwards in a lot of cognitive and philosophical just thought development that we've had in the past couple hundred years. So
just make all those things part of the religion.
Yeah.
So develop a new religion that incorporates all the developments of the past, of the Enlightenment and modernity.
I mean, just take all of the common bits of all of the popular religions, make that into a religion.
Roll it into a bowl and see what comes out.
It's basically what Carl Jung did. Like, he drew out the archetypes from religions across the world.
I think that's a good starting point.
it would have to take into account postmodernism and the fact that, or the view that there isn't an objective spiritual path to be had. It would have to be a very open and kind of fluid religion.
I mean, Hinduism is kind of like that. Actually, Hinduism incorporates Christianity. They're like, yeah, we totally understand those Christian, those Abrahamic God worshippers. You know, we let them do their thing and we worship Shiva or whatever.
Could you viably be a Hindu?
What do you like? What do you under what context?
You mean racially or
No. I mean,
or
can we imagine ourselves believing in it and taking on Hinduism and it creating meaning in our lives?
well, I remember with Sheldrake, with Rupert Sheldrake, he got to a point in his life where he wanted to find a religion, and he'd been researching in India at the time, and he said, well, maybe I should become a Hindu. But he found that it was all focused around the Indian holidays and this kind of thing. So it was very based in the culture. He couldn't really separate. So being an Englishman, he decided it made more sense for him to become a Christian because that was closer tied to the culture.
He also didn't like that, like, in Hindu society, there would be stuff like children toiling in the fields and stuff like that. And he would be like, that's pretty terrible, children toiling in the fields. And they would be like, oh, they have bad karma from previous lives. They deserve it. And he was like, I don't really like that.
Right.
Because he comes from Christian heritage.
Is that really the belief that, oh, they deserve it because they had some previous life?
I don't know if that's actually the belief that all Hindus hold, but Sheldrake said that is what the common belief was around him at the time when he was in India.
Yeah, it's like you said, he would try to do charity or something, and people would say, well, why would you do that? That's just their lot.
Yeah, I mean, one of the common beliefs of Hinduism, and I don't know how central it is, but it's a belief in reincarnation, and it's a belief in karma, and it's a belief that basically how good of a person you are or bad of a person you are or good or bad of an animal you are determines the position that you're born into in the next life. So there's kind of a sense that you deserve where you are.
And there's a very strict hierarchy of like the different kinds of humans in the Hindu view. Like there's the Brahmins and then all the castes, and there's sub-castes for everyone, which is why historically when the Christians first arrived in India, as brutal as that ended up being, Christianity actually appealed to a lot of untouchables because the Christian doctrine was like, well, everyone is equal before God.
Yeah, I mean, I think every religion has interpretations that maybe are the dominant interpretation for that religion that are undesirable, or that the entire world would not be able to get on board with. And so I think you could potentially take the good parts of all of the popular religions, or the good interpretations of all the popular religions, and somehow combine them together into like a super religion.
How do you determine what's good?
It would just be commonly held values throughout all humanity.
So the ones that are common across religions are judged to be good.
Yeah.
That's kind of what Carl Jung does. Like, he looks at all the world's religions and he picks out the patterns that he sees. So there's often like a great father archetype or a great mother archetype and the trickster archetype and these things. And he creates kind of a meta framework for understanding all religions. So you could potentially build something out of that. But I'm not sure how you'd square that with Katie's challenge before, that it be compatible with postmodernism, because
It needs to be compatible with postmodernism. It needs to be something that we could see ourselves viably, like, okay, maybe I should just speak for myself. But I mean, we can talk about constructing some ideal religion that takes the good parts of all the religions, so it's kind of got mass appeal. But when I try to put myself in the shoes of, do I actually think that any religion, or specifically any system of worship or anything where there's like truths about the supernatural world that I'm supposed to believe in, and that's supposed to guide the meaning in my life, I can't see it. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think that's true for a lot of people. And I think that's why a lot of people are falling away. It's not even so much about like their specific religion isn't appealing to them anymore. I think that religion itself isn't really doing it for people so much.
but I'm not talking about religion. We're talking about meta religion, which is a completely different thing.
Sure. I mean, we were
I'm not
talking
sure
about creating a
the
new
proposal.
religion, right?
Yeah, but we're talking about a meta-religious structure. So it's not going to be like there's a God that you believe in and you go to church every Sunday. It would be like there's archetypes. We look at the patterns that appear in every religion and we make some kind of argument that those patterns should be followed, like because they're representative of what's good. And then we incorporate those patterns into the fabric of life in some way, which isn't the same as having a traditional religion to worship.
I think this can be likened to the sort of new age spirituality, where there are archetypes, there are definite archetypes, there are, symbols and masculine and feminine energies, and there are maybe even like astrology or something like that. There's these common mythological images that people can point to that don't necessarily tell us something about what metaphysics is. They don't necessarily tell us any true objective reality. They're just a common jumping off point, which can be continually reinterpreted and reinvented as time progresses.
Okay, do you feel like your objection has been addressed or not really?
I think I understand a little bit better now. It doesn't sound like we're talking about constructing a religion. It sounds like we're talking about.
Right. Yeah. I wouldn't say what Jung constructed was a religion. I would say he constructed a common framework for the collective unconscious, which involved these images. I don't think, you could even call it a mythology, but a religion would be, a set of beliefs that are based on that mythology. And I don't think that's necessary. I don't think it's necessary to have a set of, objective, beliefs about objective reality, which are based on this mythology. Now, will people do that when they share a common mythology? Of course they will. But that's not necessarily part of the philosophical framework, although it could be kind of a momentary religious framework, which then subsequently gets broken apart and reformulated into some new religious framework.
Are we still talking about the idea of forcing everybody into one religion?
I think we've kind of drifted from it a bit, and I'd like to propose a new solution. What if we link all our brains together to form a hive mind?
I dig it.
Yeah. What if?
Would that solve the meaning crisis?
I don't see the direct relationship between the hive mind and solving the meaning crisis, but it would sure be interesting.
It seems like it could be related to what we were just talking about, like this meta framework where we extract the common patterns in all these different belief systems, and that provides us with a landscape of meaning. It's either embedded in our biology or some kind of average of all cultures, probably both, or maybe it comes from somewhere above. And then this would almost be just the most thorough way of doing that. If you take all the human beings in the world and just put all their brains together.
I mean, I think if you look at the Borg in Star Trek, they're a hive mind, and they go into this when they take Seven of Nine out of the Borg collective. She's like, my life was so meaningful. There was purpose. Like, I didn't have to think about anything. I just did stuff, and it was so beautiful and meaningful. And now I have to come up with my own sense of meaning, and this is terrible. So, you know.
But it sounds like in the Star Trek model, it sounds like that's a kind of centralized model. Like there is one part of the Borg who is deciding what is important and what you should do.
It's kind of. There's a Borg queen, but she's not necessarily coming up with all of the ideas that the hive mind is coming up with. I mean, the whole point of a hive mind is it's a hive, right? That there's there's thoughts. There's a one Borg drone will encounter something and then or have an idea, and then that will kind of immediately transmit to the rest of the drones. Or you have these things that happen. Just sort of in human history. You've had things like Newton and Leibniz discovering calculus at the same time, and things like that, where they're seemingly disconnected people discovering the same ideas at the same time. And I think that's akin to what your brain does when it comes up with ideas. It's not necessarily like one brain cell is this genius brain cell and it teaches that idea to all the rest of your brain. It's like your brain kind of emergently comes up with the idea.
Yes. Well, part of my point is about when the character exits the Borg and she feels like, now I have to take responsibility. If she were really a member of a decentralized hive mind, then she would always have some kind of individual responsibility, and she would always be able to influence the other parts of the hive.
It's billions or trillions of voices versus hers. So, whatever she contributes is proportionally not that much.
I'm not sure it would actually be an individual contributing. It would just be one consciousness coming up with ideas.
Yeah, are we talking about a total collective consciousness, or are we talking about putting everybody's individual consciousnesses into some kind of a soup where they were all acting together?
I'm not sure there's a difference between those things.
Well,
there must be a kind of spectrum. Frustrating,
I think. Well, okay. I mean, I guess one is one. In one case, everybody has their own individual consciousnesses and ideas, and they're all trying to move this body or this floating nebula or whatever the physical structure. Maybe it's not physical. I don't know. We're all trying to influence this thing, and you definitely have your own consciousness, but you don't have very much influence because there's billions of other consciousnesses all trying to influence it. I guess that's kind of like what the world is like if you're trying to impact the world and not just your own life. And then the other option is like we all become one consciousness, and there's just one unified actor.
So I just want to ask the question, what if we already are a hive mind? What if that's what we already are? Maybe the solution to the meaning crisis is realizing that.
Yeah, the internet is probably part of that. We're more connected than ever.
In some ways we are. In some ways we are probably a hive mind, or we're at least part of this larger emergent intelligence that's moving through history, but we're also individuals. We can experience ourselves as individuals and act as individuals.
One thing that Vervaeke talks about some is in these spiritual or experiences, shifting your perspective to the very small, to the very individual, and then all the way to the whole. And I think what we're talking about is part of that. Shifting our perspective might be helpful. so that we could see ourselves as a hive mind, but also see ourselves in a different way.
I don't even know if hive mind is how I would refer to how things work right now. It seems like it's more, we're all part of a larger story, while at the same time we're living out our individual stories, and they feed into each other.
Yeah, but that's the same. Like even with the Newton Leibniz example, each of them were individually acting, but they were at the same time apparently part of this larger process.
Yeah, and I think that Vervaeke would argue that the axial revolution was another example of this. I think Wikipedia kind of basically says, yeah, we had these kind of similar revolutions all happening on different parts of the globe, and it's fascinating because they weren't connected.
Yeah, there's kind of like two ways of looking at history, right? It's like in the past, history tended to be looked at as like this story of great men, right? And great individuals who would do great things. And now we more tend to look at history, or we often look at history as the movement of social forces. And like the person who ends up being the great man is kind of arbitrary. And there's probably some truth in both.
Mm-hmm. There's probably some truth in both. Massive social forces create great people, but then great people also, there has to be a catalyst for every social force, or multiple catalysts.
Yeah, there has to be an agent and an arena.
There you go. Okay. That seems like a good place to switch to a new topic. So, mindfulness classes in primary school. Would that be a good idea in addressing the meaning crisis?
I don't think that would hurt at all. I think it would only help. I don't think it would solve the meaning crisis, but I think that it would help.
So
yeah, it's a good start, a good base.
I think that the concept of prayer has that purpose. It teaches mindfulness. It teaches you to focus on something that you want and to ask the universe for it very hard.
I don't think
And you kind of go into yourself, and you're connecting with God or whatever. And I think mindfulness and prayer have a lot in common. Is all I'm saying.
I think prayer is a form of meditation, but I don't think it's a form of mindfulness meditation, at least in the way that I understand mindfulness. Mindfulness is more about observing and taking note of every single sensation that's happening to you in the moment. It's very much like inward and noticing, whereas prayer is trying to connect with something outside and focusing on something external. I think that's
probably pray thinking about a particular idea. But the way I was taught, I wasn't really ever taught prayer apart from to recite like the Lord's Prayer. And it's not really very practical. And if you leave the church, then you won't think of it like, oh yeah, I've got this mindfulness tool or this meditation tool. So it has to be a little more systematic in the way it's taught, I think, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I definitely think that you were not taught it correctly. The way that I was taught was, you kind of like open a channel to God, you like do the sign of the cross and you put your hands together. And when you do that, it kind of like starts this process where then you can just kind of have a conversation with God.
Are you suggesting prayer in schools?
Am I suggesting prayer in schools? I think that maybe more of a focus on mindfulness and like meditating, focusing on your senses, and playing with the mind. But as a young kid, I think prayer is a perfectly good starting point for that.
I have an idea of something that already exists in schools that I think is very similar to meditation. And I'm curious what you guys think of this. I think reading is extremely similar to meditation. It's like when you read a book, I think like with meditation, you're trying to clear your mind. So you're like you're thinking of nothing. But often in meditation, instead, you'll think about like one thing, like you'll focus on an image, or you'll focus on like feeling your whole body or your breath or something. But with reading, you're also only focusing on one thing. You're focusing on the narrative. And it seems very similar to me. There's a lot of similar effects when you look at the research. It reduces anxiety and improves similar brain areas. So I'm wondering, maybe we already have meditation classes in school or mindfulness classes. Like, what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, kind of, but the emphasis isn't quite on the mindfulness. So if that were more of a focus, then yes, reading would be a good meditation device.
Yeah, I think all of these practices are leaving out the mindfulness part. Like implicitly, the mindfulness is there, but I think maybe we should explain that more to kids to get them to kind of be adventurous with the process. You know, like have fun with this. You know, a lot of times we don't. You know, your teachers don't emphasize that to you. They don't. They just say like, do this. You know, and this is the correct way, and this is the wrong way. But there's not enough emphasis on, well, explore it and experiment and try different things and see what you like, you know.
So the different forms of meditation, one that I think would be really beneficial in schools, and I think reading is really beneficial in schools, but one that's definitely not in schools that I think would be really beneficial is the form where you non-reactively notice or non-judgmentally notice your own thoughts, notice your own physical sensations as they're passing through you, notice the noises around you, and just let it go. One thing what we might bring up later is this Stoic idea of separating the event from the meaning of the event. And what this form of mindfulness meditation teaches you is to non-judgmentally notice events passing. So it's like it's a literal practice at separating the event from the meaning of the event and the reaction to the event. And I think that that's something unique to mindfulness meditation that's different from just reading, something like that.
How do we think this is going to help address the meaning crisis?
So Vervaeke gets into how mindfulness is related to insight. It's a tricky one. But it's also, I think part of it is when people have mindfulness as a skill, they can engage more effectively with other people. They can communicate more. They'll be more receptive to new ideas, and that will help them navigate meaning in their lives.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of the mindfulness stuff that has to be taught to adults might not have to be taught to kids. Well, as long as you let kids do what they're just naturally going to do. Like, I think one of the reasons why I'm pretty open-minded and why I'm kind of predisposed to this mindfulness stuff is because I daydreamed so much as a kid. And I felt like there was something right about being able to just daydream and go outside and climb a tree and just feel the world go by and not be too judgmental about, you not try to apply a narrative or a meaning necessarily, but just notice things. I think little kids naturally would do that if we gave them the time and space to do it. So I think a lot of the problem is that we're trying to force them into this box where you have to learn these things, you know?
Yeah, but I think they kind of do know it of their own accord, but it's valuable to just point little things out to them so they can remember them later. Like say, hey, that thing that you're doing, it's not just, you know, something that a kid does. It's something significant, and you can carry it into adulthood.
Yeah, exactly. Like encourage them. Just be like, yeah, you know how that feels great when you just kind of daydream and let the world go by. You know, you should do that. You should take some time to do that. You know, not all the time, but you know, that is actually a helpful and positive thing.
Do you think that, well, okay, I think that there's some things that these meditations can teach you that wouldn't naturally be learned, but I'm curious if you think it's natural. Like, one thing that I think mindfulness meditation is helpful for is being able to identify the physical sensations of your own emotions and how they impact you. And I think that's extremely helpful. And I don't think it's natural, actually. maybe it's either unnatural or something is tamping it down, because I don't find that most people know how to do that.
Kids don't reflect on their emotions naturally at all. Like if you look at very little children, like 2-year-olds, they're extremely emotionally reactive. They're almost the opposite of what you would aim to be by meditating a lot.
I watched this documentary about Mr. Rogers, where he he testified before Congress about why public television should be saved, or should be continued to be funded by the government. And he convinced I guess it was a congressman, to continue the funding for his program by reciting this poem or song that he had written, which was about like, what do you do when you're just so angry, you know? And basically, I don't remember the words of the song, but it's just like, it's teaching kids emotional intelligence. It's teaching them that they have a choice, that they can either do something, like act out, aggressively, or they can just not do that. They can just sit there and just feel the feelings and, actually, Mr. Rogers was reminding me of agape. So that's a completely different topic.
I don't know. I'm not convinced that kind of thing is effective for kids. I tend to think that kids learn best by doing. And there's even research where if you have a kid and they're like watching someone speak, like if you have someone, a Mandarin speaker, come and hang out with the kid and speak Mandarin every week for like a year or so when they're little babies or toddlers, then by the end of the year, the kid will recognize a lot of Mandarin words, be able to like speak a few. But if you have them watching someone speaking Mandarin on the television, they learn nothing. They learn nothing from that language. And there's a lot of research that kids do not learn language skills from watching television. And I'm very skeptical that they learn any kinds of lessons by having someone on TV like explain it out to them. I think kids are very embodied learners.
I think with Mr. Rogers, I think he did have that quality of being able to reach through the screen, because he's saying like, think about this thing, and is patiently directing you to do these mental exercises. So I wonder if that's different. Yeah.
Mr. Rogers was a little bit special because he was provoking people to live out embodied practice. I think Mr. Rogers was a very positive cultural influence. I think he's great. I think he's great. But I think like if school teachers were actually singing that song with the kids and practicing pausing, that would be 100 times more effective than the kids listening to the song on the TV. But I'm not saying Mr. Rogers wasn't effective. Mr. Rogers is amazing. I would love to dive into his work someday. Really cool dude.
Yeah, and this is kind of just what I mean by I think maybe part of the solution is just having people like this who can teach wisdom to kids. Just have kids be more exposed to that.
I don't think that's how kids learn though. Like I've seen parents like try to teach their kids moral lessons, and whenever they kind of go about it like, kid, this is the thing you need to learn. Like it doesn't work that well. Like kids learn, they often they find it like they rebel again, like they find it unappealing. Like kids learn by doing, and they also learn through narrative. Like if you watch a Disney movie and the Disney movie has wisdom embedded in it and they're like enthralled by the story, they absorb the wisdom. But just by trying to like extract the wisdom and be like, kid, this wise thing, it doesn't work for children. I find it doesn't work.
I disagree that that's categorically the case. I think that there are people who are skilled at communicating these things in such a way that kids can actually understand and use. I think that the problems arise when the person teaching the lesson just isn't very good at teaching or doesn't understand the mindset of the kid. But I think Mr. Rogers had a pretty good grasp on the mindset of a kid.
I don't think that like,
if it's a problem that they've been having a lot, and then just think about how your brain works. If you've been having a problem a lot and you're thinking about it and you're trying to come up with solutions, but you can't, and then finally somebody gives you a piece of advice and that makes it click for you. Yeah, that's
not how children work at all though. Children don't think like adults.
That's how I worked when I was a kid. So maybe your brain is just different.
Okay.
I think Chris's brain is different, but
Different from mine is what I meant to say.
Sure. Yeah. Well,
Okay.
that's fine. We could move on, I guess.
Yeah. Do
Yeah.
people have more comments on this topic, or do we want to move on?
No. I do remember Mr. Rogers being a specifically positive influence, though. He was a master at like actually invoking the feelings that he was trying to convey. Or
Okay, I mean,
invoking a mindset.
that's fine. Like, I'm not trying to attack Mr. Rogers. I don't actually know who Mr. Rogers is, even. But
Don't attack Mr. Rogers.
but if he's evoking emotions, and that's
Rogers
again.
alone.
I mostly agree with you. Yeah, because most
Okay.
kids don't even connect. Well, I don't know what age we're talking about, but like 3 or 4, if you're a 3-year-old, you're probably at age 2 and 3, you're not even connecting your current problem to past problems that you've had in a conscious way.
Again, I would say it depends on how it's done. If you're speaking to them as an adult, then the advice might go over their head. But if you're getting into their understanding of the world, and you're wording things how they would word things, then I think very profound communication can occur.
All right, guys.
It makes sense to move on. Okay, should the government sponsor ayahuasca for the population to solve the meaning crisis?
Were we or were we not joking when we suggested that?
Well, it's a brainstorming session, so anything goes.
Sure.
Is it that crazy for the government to
discuss the
sponsor
pros and cons.
ayahuasca? Like, is that a crazy thing for the government to sponsor use of careful
No,
use of?
it's not so crazy, but I guess it would be a voluntary program. Like, we're not talking about mandatory ayahuasca ceremonies, are we?
Yeah, no, I'm not talking about mandatory. It's like government sponsored.
Yeah. So sponsorships or scholarships to become ayahuasqueros or something.
I mean, in general, I'm against government-sponsored anything because I think that the private sector can provide those things better than the government can. However, it probably would be a positive force in the world to just have like a government-sponsored clinics where people could go and maybe buy their own ayahuasca or something like that, and then have the guidance of somebody who knows what they're doing.
Maybe some government grants or something like that would be a good idea. I would be really terrified of any government-run ayahuasca clinic, though. Like, I think that would be a lot of bad trips.
Like people telling you, don't resist the thought, don't resist what's coming next, don't resist this wisdom that ayahuasca is delivering to you.
Am I being detained?
Not even that, but just like thinking about how government programs are often run, or thinking about how government offices often feel, because something like ayahuasca or any psychedelic experience is so much about set and setting, and it's not even necessarily about tangible things like we need to systematize how the place looks. It's about, you really need to get the right people who are really experts at creating a good vibe and a safe feeling, and maybe government, if it changed completely, could do that, but I don't think that it would work very well. Like, governments aren't generally very good at even providing like basic human decency and customer service, so tasking them with shamanism would, I think, be dangerous.
Another issue is it would be once you make it legal, even if it was in the private sector, it would be subject to liability. It's not currently. So people had bad trips or.
Yeah, that's true. There would be no incentive for the government to provide a good experience.
One thing that's interesting is psilocybin was apparently decriminalized recently in Colorado. And Michael Pollan, who wrote a book about psychedelics recently, actually was skeptical about the decision. He said he's not sure if society is ready for psilocybin to be legal. I thought that was a really interesting response. What do you guys think about that?
Well, it's kind of funny because it's more or less freely available in nature. You just have to have a bit of knowledge and the spores are generally legal throughout the world as well, so you can grow your own. So it's kind of funny, like, is the legality really a big barrier? I guess it's mainly psychological, like because people think it's illegal, maybe they won't do it. Maybe they assume it's dangerous.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think the fact that you're going on this kind of spirit journey while doing a substance that's illegal can actually color the experience in a dark way. I guess the first question is, do we want to prevent people from doing mushrooms, and do we think that legality has that effect? And then the other question would be, if people are already going to do it anyway, regardless of its legality, then maybe it should just be legal, because then maybe people will actually have good experiences.
It's an interesting thing. It's kind of a paternalistic thing for him to say that. I do think that the fact that psychedelics are illegal now basically means that the people who have experiences with them are either very rebellious or kind of elite. Like, I think in Silicon Valley, psychedelic experiences are extremely common and this knowledge is common. So the fact that it's illegal is kind of like a psychological barrier, and it means that you only have access if you're running in certain circles with are either seedy or hippie or kind of techie or high end or whatever. But to say that society's not ready for psilocybin to be legal, it means that he's saying that he thinks that he and his friends are like evolved enough to have access, but that the vast majority of people are not. Maybe that's true, but it's an interesting statement. Basically, he's saying, like, yeah, the people, he wrote a book about psychedelics and how it benefited him, and maybe he wasn't outright promoting it, but he was kind of promoting it to his audience. So he's kind of in a way saying, you know, the people who are smart enough to read my book and the people who are smart enough to be in these circles who have access to psychedelics should have access to psychedelics, but we shouldn't just open it up to the unwashed masses. That's kind of how it sounds.
Well, and I think there is something to be said for that you do kind of want people to have knowledge, right? You want people to do some research, at least on the internet or something like that, before they do these substances. So I do think that substances just kind of released into a society can have negative effects if people are just, you know, they're like teenagers, right? And their friends are like, hey, have this drug, you know, and there's no knowledge, you know, that goes into, you know, no research that happens before to really understand what's about to happen.
And I think it's more like that now, being illegal.
Well, do we think that psilocybin and these psychedelics are things that you need to reach a certain level before trying? Or do we actually think it's just cool for everyone?
This is a question that comes up a bit in ayahuasca forums, like on Facebook groups and stuff. People will ask if a 5-year-old can take ayahuasca or if a pregnant woman can take ayahuasca. And I've seen it in ceremonies. I've seen a pregnant woman take ayahuasca, and the shaman was welcoming of it. And I've seen like a 10-year-old child take ayahuasca. And it sounds, I know, like you made that face, Ariel. I think it sounds strange from our perspective. Like, it seems like this is, I suppose, an intoxicant like alcohol or marijuana or something, and it should be restricted to people who are 18 or 21 or something like that. But I don't think that's the perspective that really bears out when it comes to these kinds of medicines. And I think maybe it's also something to do when the child feels they're ready. So maybe a child can have informed consent in that context.
I completely disagree.
The hard thing is, I don't like the implications of what Paulin is saying, but I do kind of agree with it in some ways. I don't know that I agree that it should remain illegal, but I don't think it's a good idea for the average unprepared person to be taking psychedelic drugs. I think that it's really easy for psychedelic trips to be extremely traumatizing, or for them to be kind of reckless and if they're done in a party setting. And also for people who have anxiety issues, or for people who aren't prepared to be able to separate what's happening, and you know, kind of distance themselves from it. They are really psychologically dangerous substances, and I don't think that most people are ready for them.
Yeah,
I don't
I'd
know
say
that even I was ready for it when I tried it.
Yeah, well, that's another point. I think, like with Pollen saying people aren't ready, I think you're never really ready for something when it comes. So it's like in the way of The Superior Man, where he talks about leaning into your edge. Or say, I remember I listened to a speaker once, and he was talking about having his first child, and he thought, am I really ready to become a father? Well, you better be. So there has to be a little bit of that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was actually thinking that, like, right as you were saying it, is I also don't think that the vast majority of people are ready for parenthood, but I would never suggest that parenthood should be illegal or that you should need a government license to be able to experience one of the most meaningful things in life. So maybe that's the appropriate perspective for psychedelics as well. It is something really impactful. Maybe most people aren't ready for it, like most people aren't ready to be having kids when they're having kids, but to prevent people and set some kind of a legal standard and create some kind of a classist or intellectual elitist thing where we're ready for psychedelics and you people can't do it, I think would be worse than allowing people the freedom to fulfill themselves. And I do think that psychedelic experiences are, I mean, as meaningful and life-changing for some people as having a child.
Yeah, and
but I mean, if you're taking this like que sera perspective of like when psychedelics come to you is the time to do them, then arguably on a societal level, what that would look like would be something like when they become legal, they become legal. Like things seem to be moving in that direction. Cannabis is becoming legal in more and more places, and psilocybin is probably next. And que sera, sera.
I don't think that means que sera, sera. Like having children is legal for anyone of any age. You know, it's not illegal to have a baby, even if you have no job and you don't know anything about child rearing and you're completely mentally ill. It's not illegal to have a baby. That doesn't mean that it's societally encouraged. That doesn't mean that teen pregnancy is
well, but it's biologically enforced. I mean, like you physically can't have a baby until you're a certain age. So I mean,
sure.
I think that helps.
Yeah.
Imagine if 5-year-olds were having kids. Like,
well, that would be horrible.
Well,
but
it
I mean,
happens.
but I mean, even 9-year-olds can.
Yeah, and that is
in some
illegal.
cases,
It is
like,
illegal. Like you can't get married or have kids below a certain age.
you can't get married, but
They're not going to put you in prison for it.
If one of the people was older, they would put that person.
if one of the people is older, and certainly we tell like young kids not to have sex, and certainly we would tell young kids not to do psychedelics as well, and like age restrictions are another thing. But the point that I'm trying to make is that just because something's legal doesn't mean that society is encouraging it, but it allows people the freedom to be able to do it. It doesn't mean it's que sera.
Yeah, I think that codifying something in law is kind of a blunt hammer. It's kind of like, you know, we want this social norm to be enforced, and so we're going to do it at the point of a gun. And it's like, maybe some things should be enforced that way, but I think these sort of more edge case issues should be enforced socially, right? And there should be people who are knowledgeable about these things who can educate the less experienced people, and the like good behavior will kind of reinforce itself if that's allowed to happen. And sometimes I think codifying things in law kind of removes that. It just, now there's nobody that you can go to for knowledge about this thing, or, you know, maybe you can find it on the internet. So I do think that in the case of drugs, it's generally harmful, I think, to have them be like felonies, you know, if you're caught with the substance. You know, I think at the very least, all drugs should be decriminalized, and you know, people who are abusing drugs should be treated as, you know, sick rather than criminal.
Yeah. One thing I think about when I was in high school and they gave us this drug education, they would say stuff like, well, generally the drugs that are outlawed are ones that have a high potential for overdose. And we were like, okay, all right, fair enough. But it wasn't till years later that it clicked and I was like, hang on, cannabis doesn't have any risk of overdose.
Yeah, and
They
alcohol.
lied to us. Yes, and alcohol has a very high risk of overdose.
Exactly. And I think that exact thing, that kind of like break of trust is even more harmful than just having the drugs be decriminalized would be.
Yes. And they would also say stuff like, well, why do people smoke cigarettes? And they would never say stuff like, well, smoking cigarettes gives you a little bit of buzz, or it's, it's something kind of fun to do. It can like ease your tension, paradoxically, or something like that. They would never say that. They would only list the negative effects, or like if you go on these anti-drug sites today, they're like, oh, well, if you take magic mushrooms, you might have powerful, intense visions of demonic figures and maybe feel a slight euphoria. And the small text at the bottom, I'm like, hang on, this is this is what you're going to tell people. This
basically
is
describing a nightmare trip.
Bill Hicks has this bit where he talks about, how whenever you hear about LSD on the news, it's always something negative. Man takes LSD and thinks he can fly and jumps out of a building and kills himself. And Bill Hicks says, like you're sitting there thinking, what a jerk, but then he says, why don't we have positive drug stories? Why don't we have like, man takes acid and realizes that all of reality is connected and we're all this objective being that's experiencing itself subjectively.
Yeah, matter is nothing but energy condensed to a low vibration.
Yeah, but I mean, you can make I mean, I agree that's a big problem and it engenders lack of trust, but I think you can make the exact same case for the cannabis industry right now, that they're doing just the opposite thing, where they're presenting cannabis like it's this wonder drug that cures every illness, and the high is completely benign and is really great, and if you have any kind of anxiety, you should be smoking cannabis all day long, and there's no side effects or problems.
And I think that's the problem, because
there are lots of dangerous things that kill people all the time that are completely legal. Look at driving. Okay,
but that's not the point I'm making, Chris. You're missing the point I'm making, though. The point I'm making is that this kind of propaganda where you're only presenting something very one-sidedly for your own political purposes is happening on both sides.
Of course it is. That's how politics works. This side says marijuana is evil and it will cause you to, reefer madness, you'll just start raping things, and then on this side, it's like, well, we want weed to be legal. And so we have to, rose tinted glasses it a little bit, like both sides are going to kind of over make their case because they're trying to pass some policy. That's just how politics works.
Yeah, it's really difficult to present a fair and unbiased and like, here are the positives and negatives, and then say, well, it should be illegal. It should be legal, rather.
Yeah, if the illegal side
do that,
the illegal side is arguing like this is a terrible thing, and the legalization side is saying, well, sometimes it's good and sometimes bad, then the general public is going to be like, okay, well, 75% of the time it's bad.
Yeah,
so it's going to stay illegal. So if you wanted to,
maybe if the general public though is that simplistic, then maybe they aren't ready for psilocybin, which is a much more intense drug than cannabis.
Or maybe psilocybin will help them take control of their own cognitive processes, which will cause them to become more enlightened, so that they can make their own decisions.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like
the government treat them like children.
I feel like you guys are making this argument that's kind of like reactively anti-government or reactively anti-criminalizing things. But I mean, it feels more subtle than this. I'm not necessarily saying, these drugs should be criminalized, but I do think it's more complicated. Like we're talking about, Vervaeke talks a lot about how these substances should be taken in the context of a wisdom community, and in the context of like a shamanic community. And if you're just saying like, well, it should just be legalized and people should make their own individual choices, before any shamanic community exists or is widespread, I think there's real dangers in that.
Aria, we're all agreeing on that it's a little bit more complicated than, drugs are a unequivocal good or drugs are an unequivocal bad. Like nobody is saying that. Everybody is saying what you're saying, which is that it's a little bit complicated. We're just arguing the different sides.
I'm trying to take it to a more consequentialist position, because I feel like you guys are doing a very first principles, like paternalism is bad, government criminalization is bad, therefore all drugs should be legal. And maybe
that's a very low version of what we're arguing.
Here's the thing. How do you say that it's definitely a good thing to keep it illegal, or what are the good consequences of keeping it illegal?
I'm
I
not
feel straw
necessarily
man.
saying I never said it's for sure a good thing to keep it legal or to keep it
No,
illegal.
but what are the good consequences? What are the good consequences?
I think if you legalized all psychedelic drugs and made them freely available right now as things currently exist, I think a lot of people would treat them very disrespectfully and would introduce them into party cultures where they were completely inappropriate, because I think a lot of the youth culture and pop culture right now is at a very low vibrational level. I think that could cause a lot of problems. I think that could cause mental breakdowns. I think it could cause violence. I think it could cause an increase in psychological problems instead of an increase in vibration level. And I think it could cause a lot of people to really dismiss those drugs pretty early on, and to maybe even recriminalize them, be like, okay, we're not trying that again. I think doing things prematurely can be as dangerous as not doing them at all.
Yeah, I think we all agree on that.
Those things happen already. Like
but wait, there's a lot of research. There's a lot of research that when you legalize something, it becomes more common. And if you put something in stores and make it freely available, like Katie pointed out before, the people doing psychedelics now are kind of either you have to be involved in a certain subculture, or you have to really want it enough to like order it off the dark web or something.
Yeah,
but you know, if you make it freely available, it's available in the mass culture, which I'm sorry, the mass culture is at a low vibrational level. Maybe that is
for now.
Just because you legalize something doesn't mean that Target is going to be carrying it, for one. But also, when you have something be illegal, it's impossible for the kinds of communities like shamanic communities or whatever to arise, because you can't.
Right, exactly.
It's illegal for any institutions to be built up around.
But they arise illegally. That's the thing.
Behavior. When you ban a behavior, you're preventing a market solution to the problems that when a behavior is banned and then you legalize it, then suddenly, yes, you have problems, okay? But then the market comes up with solutions to those problems instead of the government, because the government just is like, all they can do is, do this or don't do this.
Well, some things need to be banned, and some things have really benefited from being. No.
So what we're saying is that if the government were to unban these things, then shamanic communities would be able to start growing to gain the wisdom in order for the substance not to be harmful. But that's of course, that's a risk that we incur as a society when we first legalize something that was previously banned, is that, okay, now this thing is legal and nobody knows what the fuck they're doing.
Yes, if it happens at the right moment, like if it happens with the right timing. If it happens prematurely, I think my scenario is pretty likely.
Well,
right, and that's why I'm actually advocating let's gradually legalize it in more and more jurisdictions, and I think that's what you're seeing. And I think Denver going first with legalizing mushrooms is great, or I guess decriminalizing mushrooms is great.
Here's something. So ayahuasca is actually legal in a lot of places, and there are already shamanic organizations propping up. Like when I took that ayahuasca ceremony the other week, that was legal. It's an organization, like they take credit cards. This is how legal it is. And it's here in Argentina, it's illegal, but they have centers in Chile and about 15 or 20 countries, I believe. So this is how legal this stuff is. And it's not like everybody's going crazy with ayahuasca and using it in parties. But obviously that's a different case. In terms of staggering the policy or introducing it slowly, I point out the case of Spain with the way they legalized cannabis. So if you go to Spain, you can't really go, well, legally you can't go as a drug tourist. You can't just go and walk into any store and buy weed. You can buy CBD products in stores, but legally you can't go into a cannabis club. So you need a permit. It takes about 2 weeks for you to get the permit. So you have to have some kind of willing to stay in Spain for a little bit longer to do that. So that's one way you could possibly introduce this thing, like have centers that have permits and then let it get into the culture slowly.
So one thing, I think that one great solution that it would probably work really well and alleviate a lot of Ariel's concerns, and these are concerns that I have too, would actually be for ayahuasca to be legal first. However, I don't know if there's a way to politically frame it for ayahuasca to be legal first. The reason being that the reason that ayahuasca isn't a social issue in terms of it being a party drug or whatever is because ayahuasca is a tea, a bad tasting tea that makes you vomit and like have diarrhea. And there's a very intense part of the experience that just would not translate into casual abuse or teen culture to take ayahuasca. So it's not, it makes sense to take it to a center, like to take it in a center for anybody who's interested in having that psychedelic experience. If ayahuasca was legalized first, then you would have a culture of ayahuasca centers and kind of you have more of a psychedelic culture and a respect for psychedelics in the places where it's legal. I would imagine it would be a way for these things to be built up before decriminalizing or legalizing other things, and for society to understand.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good idea. I mean, my concern is more with psilocybin and LSD. I think LSD in particular already has a relationship in party culture that's pretty toxic. Like I've seen it, and I've seen even in psilocybin.
Yeah, LSD and psilocybin for sure, especially since LSD is a tiny tab, and LSD is already seen like that for a lot of people. You're right.
And I've seen a lot of people, like party people, start doing acid and get really messed up. Like you can get addicted to it and messed up by it. So
yeah, and I would emphasize again the importance of having experienced people to tell you about all of the bad things that can happen so that you can avoid them.
So let's talk about something else. So one suggestion we had for solving the meaning crisis is getting people off the hamster wheel and doing self-work, looking for meaning, traveling on their own, quitting their jobs, maybe some kind of UBI program to encourage this. What do people think of that?
I think there are upsides and downsides, just like with the other things that we're proposing. I think that UBI is a good idea on a short-term scale. I think that long-term, you're essentially incentivizing being lazy. So if there were a way to do UBI kind of cyclically, I think that would be really good.
Or maybe like when somebody first turns 18, they receive it for a few years, and that way they can figure things out in their life.
In Canada, we almost do have a cyclical, like for people who are seasonal workers, so like landscapers or stuff like that, you do some kind of summer-based work, you get EI basically the rest of the year. So it's a little nuts. Like I know people who like they work in the summer and then they spend all winter just like working on their band or whatever, like able-bodied young people. So it still is kind of is a deal. I think in Europe they have even more extensive. But I guess UBI is different because it's for everybody, not just.
Yeah, a lot of muso friends of mine used to talk about moving to New Zealand because they said, well, if you're in New Zealand, the government will just pay you the dole to be a musician. I'm not sure if that's still true.
The thing about this is, even if we had this cyclical UBI or a UBI where you get it for 2 years when you're 18 to figure yourself out, this is a cultural issue, and I think probably the effect of that UBI would just be a lot of 18-year-olds sitting around for a couple of years and then delaying because there's no pressure or incentive unless there's something deeper within the culture that shifts.
Right. Yeah, so you have to have some kind of framework behind it. But on the other hand, kind of sitting around that's kind of the point. Like if you have to sit around for a while and think about things and finally figure out, hang on, sitting around all the time sucks.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. Like people tend to have meaning crises more when they are sitting around doing nothing. Like people who have demanding jobs tend not to have meaning crises. So it's like a question, like why is that?
Well, it depends. I think it depends on if your job is creating meaning for you. If your job is creating meaning for you, then going to your job every day is going to be great for you. But if your job is just eating your soul, then I think that can be extremely terrible for your long-term psychological health, and you should get out of there.
I think it's like people distract themselves from the deeper questions. And that's why you have a thing like a midlife crisis, because you delayed those questions for so many years, putting all of your effort into your job. And then one day you're like, hang on, what am I doing here?
Yeah, you have to come to the realization both that working all the time is not going to bring you meaning, and sitting around all the time is not going to bring you meaning. There needs to be a process of figuring out what your meaning is or what your purpose is, and then putting your nose to the grindstone and doing it.
I feel like there's like an archetypal baby boomer story and an archetypal millennial story. And like the archetypal baby boomer story is like getting a good job, 9 to 5, having a family dog, living in the suburbs, and then being like, oh, wow, my life feels meaningless. And the archetypal millennial story is like traveling the world, being a digital nomad, not being able to find a job, having serial relationships, and being like, oh, I don't have meaning either.
Yeah. It's almost like we witnessed, like Eat, Pray, Love, which is basically the story of the archetypal baby boomer woman who has a life and has a family and has a white picket fence, and then she kind of gets divorced and then travels the world and has serial relationships and finds meaning. It's like millennials saw that and we're like, yeah, all this stuff is stupid. We're just going to travel the world and have serial relationships and find meaning, but then we never build anything, so we feel completely meaningless.
Yeah, exactly. And millennials, I think, at least this was true for me, and it seems to be true for a lot of people I know, can find a lot of meaning by staying in one place and building something. And that's actually why I think Jordan Peterson has been really influential recently.
Yeah. Okay. So to be fair, we're not talking about the archetypal millennial, though. Like most millennials do not actually travel the world. I think
they want to.
Yeah.
Well, I think the archetypal millennial, like the archetypal doesn't necessarily mean most common, because I think a lot of people are still living in the old archetypes. But
you're right. I should have said not archetypal. We're not talking about the average millennial. Like most millennials are just not having a fulfilling job and not getting to travel and really broke and
living with their parents. There's something like in North America, like a third of millennials live with their parents or something crazy like that.
Yeah, and
it's living with your parents
in Europe.
It's good for everybody in the rest of the world.
No, I don't think it's good to live with your parents at all. I think actually there's a lot of problems with it.
Yeah, I mean,
other topic.
At some point you have to take care of your own needs. At some point your parents are going to die. It's sad but true.
Well, in the rest of the world, you take care of your parents too.
Yeah, I had a student once from Ecuador, and he said, "Oh, my wife's out of town. I have to go to my parents' place so they can cook me dinner." And I was like, "Hang on, you're a grown man. You don't know how to even fry some veggies?"
Yeah, this is exactly what I'm talking about. A lot of meaning actually can be had in, just learning how to address your own needs.
Going on a hero's journey, which you can't really do when you, as the initial stage of the hero's journey is symbolically like leaving your parents' house or leaving your small community and going out into the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's so funny because it does seem like that's a relatively recent thing. Well, I guess in the tribe with rites of passage it was different, but in a lot of countries that's just how it is. Like in Brazil, most of Latin America, you're going to stay with your parents, then you get married, and then you move in with your new family.
So I definitely agree that the hero's journey is much more emphasized in Western culture than in other cultures.
It's a deeply, deeply Western thing, yeah. But I don't know. It's like arguably like we are Westerners. Like I feel like going on a hero's journey feels like it would it hits something much deeper in us as Western subjects than taking on going to live in a small community with all my relatives and getting married. At least for me, that's how I feel.
For sure.
And I think Jordan Peterson would argue that one of the reasons why the West has done so well is because of this hero's journey archetype, where we're encouraged to go out and find some new knowledge for ourselves and bring it back to our society for the benefit of everyone.
Do you think we're making an assumption about the meaning crisis? Like, when I actually look back and think about history, I don't know. Do you think that people felt more of a sense of meaning in the past, or it was just that life was so difficult and structures were so rigid that they didn't have any time to think or question it?
When
Were
life
they
is
actually happy
difficult,
with
you
it?
will find meaning. And
Yeah,
it's like when you get a break, you go to the party or whatever, and you have a good time because you know you won't necessarily have a good time otherwise.
and it's like I do feel like you can still see people in the world who kind of live within older meaning structures, and it seems like they do see things at a pretty profoundly different level. Like they're not like, they don't seem to be torn apart by this like, who am I? What does it all mean? Like it seems like more instead they see everything around them as like deeply embedded with like moral significance and meaning, and they're just like kind of doing what they're doing, and it all seems very important to them, like older people who are like very religious and stuff like that. Like it's just different. I don't see, it does seem pretty fundamentally different.
Yeah, there's definitely a gap between our parents' generation and our generation.
I mean I'd say more like great grandparents and us, but maybe for some people parents and us.
In some sense, I agree with you, but then other times I think that we romanticize the past and our grandparents' experiences. Like when I think about a lot of elderly people, a lot of times they're very, very guarded about talking about their feelings or anything deeper. And it's not even culturally acceptable to express any kind of feelings of meaninglessness within the framework that they live in. And I don't know if it's that they don't feel that, or if it's that they don't feel that they can express it because that would be so socially bad. I mean, things I think about like spousal abuse, child abuse, alcoholism, these things were all more prevalent in older generations in the US anyway than they are now.
It's kind of like what Kurt said, like how, it's like the dark times that bring you meaning. Or put another way, maybe we have to have problems to solve in order to feel like our lives are meaningful. And maybe we just don't have that many problems to solve.
Yeah, and I mean I'm not totally convinced that like those things directly come from a lack of meaning. Because like if you look at some groups of people, like you get dark for a second. If you look at like ISIS and radical Islamists, like they definitely have a narrative of meaning. Like they have a sense of meaning, but they carry out a lot of violence and abuse, and in many cases abuse amphetamines and stuff like that. I think it's kind of complicated.
Yeah, it is kind of complicated. I didn't really think about that. Yeah. Often ideologues who have very deep senses of meaning are the ones who carry out the most horrific abuse.
So we want to have meaning in our lives, but we want to make sure it's the correct meaning.
That's a good point.
Correct.
I mean, maybe ideologues, especially in the modern times, on some level, some part of them maybe is rebelling against the ideological rigidity. Like that's a counter argument. At some subconscious level, they're like, no, it doesn't make sense. But I'm not so sure.
Well, often when you hear ideologues speak, you can almost tell that they're reacting to the meaning crisis, so to speak, or they're reacting to, if you hear someone who's become a fundamentalist, like a convert, speak, a lot of times they'll talk about how they were in this materialistic world, they were caught up in a rough crowd, their life didn't have any meaning in it, so they found this thing.
Yeah, it sounds like that. I don't know if you guys have seen that video of this radical feminist, and she's saying if you shave your armpits, you are literally less of a woman because the mass of the hair of your armpits is taken away from your body. I used to be what does she say? A hop, a handmaiden of the patriarchy, but now I discovered the truth. It's pretty intense.
Damn.
Yeah.
And people can
become ideological about all kinds of, about, there's a lot of different ideologies to fall into.
Yeah,
But
about body hair.
I still think there's a difference. I think there's like a lot of different things to distinguish, because like in the past was different from the present too. Like someone who's like in modern day Canada and who's like a fundamentalist Christian has a very different psychology than someone who is like a peasant in medieval, Yorkshire or whatever, living on a feudal farm. Like it's a completely different psychology. And it's like also, someone living in contemporary Middle East, it's a different psychology from either of those people, has a different psychology from someone living in the Ottoman Empire. So it's like, there are common threads, but I think it's different psychologies in each case. And I think it's especially a different psychology if someone is in kind of a contemporary secular context and they're like deciding to become ideological versus someone who just grew up in a society that was extremely religious and are just religious.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times you find people just react to whatever substrate they grew up in. So if they grew up in a very ideological substrate, then they end up rebelling against that and becoming kind of free thinkers. And if they grew up in a very free thinking substrate, then they end up becoming kind of ideological sometimes. I wanted to talk about, somebody had mentioned the process of radicalization. I think the important component of that is, and this can happen with, whenever you find an ideology or something like that, that's negative, but it also can be a very positive experience for you and the society around you, depending on what it is. Usually it's a narrative, right? It's a narrative that explains your past and your future, right? It tells you what you're doing right now and what you've been doing and what you're going to be doing. And it's like this, it's such a relief to find that, because you feel like, oh, I've been telling myself the wrong story this whole time, or I've been listening to the stories that other people have been telling me and they've been wrong. And then you finally find this one, Vervaeke would call it like a cascade of insights, or a way to a systematic insight, which fixes all of the errors in your previous thinking, right? And it's this new narrative that you can replace the old narrative with, that just explains everything in a much more coherent way. But of course, there are pitfalls where you can end up believing something very ardently that is simply false.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of danger in, we're talking about finding the right kind of meaning. I think there's a lot of danger in systems of meaning that purport to explain everything, like that claim to be totalizing. It gets back to what we're talking about with ideological totalism and cults. Like, we don't want the solution to the meaning crisis to be some kind of cheap grace, like a cult or a dogmatic ideology.
Yeah, that's almost like a red flag when an ideology says, "I literally have the answers to everything." It's almost like, yeah, you shouldn't listen to those people.
Okay, let's try another topic. I think one thing that was interesting that was brought up is the question that maybe we have no right talking about this unless we solve our own personal meaning crises. So I'd be interested in hearing if you guys feel that your own personal meaning crises have been solved, or maybe if it's irrelevant that your personal meaning crisis remains solved or unsolved, or what you guys think about that general topic.
So I think it's normal and healthy for people to have meaning crises, existential crises, quite frequently. So maybe once a year or once every 6 months, you stop and question, and it's probably a little uncomfortable, but the more it happens, the more comfortable you get with it. So it's not like there's one ultimate solution. It's like at different points of your life, you will find different solutions and continue asking the meaningful questions.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It seems to me, the more I experience life, that life is a cycle of, it's like a wave, right? Like you have these moments of pure, like, meaningful bliss where you can see the narrative of all of time, just stretching out, infinitely into the past and infinitely into the future, and you can see how everything works. And those moments are very enlightening. And then and then as soon as you have that, then you start down the other side, and you start to be like, well, there are some problems with that way of looking at things. And you start running up against the limits of whatever model you've created. And then your model kind of slowly falls apart until you hit this kind of pit of despair. And then you're like, oh, nothing means anything, and nothing makes any sense. And what am I even doing here? And then, and then the moment that you ask that question, you start to think about the new ways that your life could have meaning. And then you kind of start back up, and then starts all over again.
I guess the question is, are we living that way? Because I definitely relate to what you were saying, Chris. The question is, are we living that way because we're in the midst of the meaning crisis? And there's going to be a point of stability that we find, kind of like what we're talking about at the beginning. Like we'll find some kind of meta system, and everyone's going to be like, oh, and then we'll be kind of all believing in something together for a bit? Or is that just kind of how it's going to be from now on?
Yeah, I think as a society, we're going through the pit right now. Postmodernism is maybe everything is just power and nothing really matters, and nothing is true. I think that's the prevalence of postmodernism seems to indicate to me that society is on that kind of trough level. So I think this is the bottom, and I think what we're doing now and what Vervaeke is working on, and maybe incorporating, all of these elements of Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy together, I think that's going to lead us back up.
I think that when people had more overarching belief systems that they and society really, really in, it was easier when we go through those cycles because there's something to go back up to. But for us right now, living in the meaning crisis, for those of us who don't have a particular philosophy or religion or creed that we were raised in and believed in, we have to construct our own meaning. And when we get into that pit, we have to reevaluate and say, okay, is what we had constructed before actually real and good and true? Or are we starting over and making something completely new? I think it is a little bit harder because of the time that we're living in. But I do agree with everyone's general sense that life goes in cycles. Hopefully, though, everything goes in waves and undulations. But the idea that I'd like to think is if you're in a crisis and your undulations get really big for a while and you go way down here, hopefully when things settle again, you'll be at a higher point than where you were before.
Yeah, I think maybe the difference between the past and the current day is, I think in the past, people's cycles were, like you said, Katie, they were all nested within a general belief framework that would persist for the life. So it could be like, oh, like, I'm going to marry that person. And it's like, oh, no, we're not going to get married. And then that would be like a crisis, but it would be like a reevaluation of a belief, but it would be within the context of Christianity. It wouldn't be a total existential crisis. You could still go to church and be like, pastor, and I don't know what to do. And then the pastor would be like, oh, well, it's the will of God, and we'll find someone else for you to marry. So it's still within the whole big framework, whereas it seems like today the crises are more like there's no clear existential system. So it's like full existential crises are happening all the time. And even like personal crises can spark existential crises, which is much more chaotic.
I think religious doubt was part of it in the past too, but at least there was something to go back to.
Yeah, exactly. It's like probably different. It's probably still, you're still tethered to the framework, even if it's like you're Christian and then you have some doubt and then you come back, or you have some doubt and it's different than it's just like there's just a whole bunch of belief systems and you can believe in any of them and you just go from this one to this one, and the doubt is like nihilism.
Yeah. To answer your first question on whether I feel like my own meaning crisis I would say the answer is no, it's not resolved. I do feel that I'm starting to construct a system though that I go back to consistently, though it's not so stable and it's still a bit ineffable, but I feel like I'm getting somewhere.
What is the system?
It's helpful. Well, it's not easy to put into words. That's part of the problem with it. But I guess you could call it somewhat of kind of the system we've talked about that maybe you would call neo-Buddhist, or life being like an amazing opportunity or a canvas that I want to do the best thing with as possible, and remembering the great opportunity or sandbox that this blip of existence is. And so trying to do something that is not only fun but also good. I want to help myself and others and the world to like flourish and reach its best potential. I think that's more or less the framework that I'm working under. When I'm down, I always go back to the idea of potential.
The potential for what?
The potential for beauty and goodness and fulfillment and connection.
So you kind of just look back into your memory and remember the good times and remind yourself that those things can happen again.
Not only that, but remind myself that those good things can happen again, but also remind myself of the progress that I'm making in creating bigger and bigger things each step along the way. Like every time I have a down and come out of it, I feel like my ups are a little bit better and I'm able to propel myself forward a little bit more. And it's also not just for myself. It's also from like kind of like a historical perspective. I really believe in human potential. And I think that the fact that we evolved into these self-reflective creatures, that yes, we're in mortal carnal bodies and there's a lot of weird things that come along with that and weird animal instincts and violent behaviors. There's these moments of beauty and life is getting better for most people and starvation is decreasing, violence is decreasing. We're slowly, as a society, creating something better, or we can if we don't mess it up too much. There's plenty of threats to that, but basically I want myself and others, not just humans, but the universe to be able to flourish into the best potential that it can have. That's my drive. I figure we're here already, so we might as well try to make the best of this opportunity.
Chris and Kurt, do you guys feel like you've solved your personal meaning crises? I guess Chris already answered. You feel like there was the up and down. So Kurt, do you feel?
Yeah, well, that's, that relates to Chris's answer. Like I said, that thing about how I don't think there's a permanent solution. It's like this series of going back and asking these questions. But maybe, well, I guess I'd say, no, I probably haven't solved my own meaning crisis. I mean, it's funny because I think I know I find meaning in a lot of things, and I have peak experiences a lot, like. And depending on the cycle, it might be like every day, and I'll see something, like maybe something really small, like the other day, I saw this old man pass a young lady, and he's like, can you tell me the way to whatever this place is? And she was like, oh yes, it's right down there. And he was like, he was really excited about this simple answer. I was like, that's fucking awesome. This guy just loves life. And I think there's a lot of meaning to be found in these small moments. But in terms of a overarching system or something like that, I don't know. I mean, I guess that's a big part of it. The small moments are a big part of everything. So that's the one thing.
Interesting.
What about you, Ariel? Where are you in your meaning ride?
Thanks for asking, Chris. I would say for me, I feel like there's like a process, like a spiral upwards that happens where each time I have an existential crisis, my belief system becomes more meta. maybe not the first time. I started off with a certain belief system, and then I had an existential crisis, and it just got destroyed, and I constructed a new one. And they were kind of on the same level of meta, but I had this like understanding in my mind, like I was wrong before, and now I'm right. But then when that second belief system was destroyed, I could no longer. You start to question, like, okay, is it that I was wrong, and then I was wrong, and then now I'm right, or is it that maybe it's more complicated? Like maybe the truth is distributed between the different paradigms I've gone through in a more complex way. And so I start thinking about it in a different way that's more meta, where I'm like looking down at everything I believed before. And now I'm like, almost like I'm at a different level at the house. And now it's like, I'm looking down at like the rooms I was in before, and I can see all of them at once. And it's like a challenge to like, the challenge is to be able to like still embody some part of the old belief systems and not like completely just be like angry at them for letting me down. And I feel like now I have a certain perspective that incorporates my old belief systems, and it's just about being able to do that emotionally. But I also feel like even like my current perspective, there's like cracks in it, and I recognize like that there's going to need to be like a new paradigm shift. It's like the dialectic. Like each time you go upwards, you can like the new framework incorporates all the old frameworks, but it's like a traumatic process every time it happens, and then you have to, you know, it's not only belief, it's like a whole, like each belief system is like, if I'm living my life in an aligned way, it's like a lived experience, right? Like I'm living my life in a certain way according to that belief system, and when that gets destroyed, I need to like uproot everything, and it's like traumatic. But I feel like I'm getting there. I don't necessarily know that there's a final point, but I mean, I hope to eventually get to the point where I can come up with stuff that's more and more useful to other people and helps me to live a fulfilled life, and maybe even further some cosmic meaning that's guiding all of this.
Do you feel like you have momentum? Do you feel like you're on an upswing, I guess?
I feel like I definitely have momentum. I guess like one of my fears is that I'm completely on the wrong path, and I'm like going really hard with a lot of momentum down the completely wrong path. And the more time goes by, the more lost I'm getting. And someday I'm just going to look and be like, I'm in the completely wrong place. Like, what am I even doing? Like, I just took a wrong turn a really long time ago, and now I'm completely lost. And so I'm afraid of that happening. But I definitely feel like I have some momentum in some direction. I think it's a good direction. I hope it is.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're all in a good direction.
We're all in similar directions, so we're either right or it's a shared delusion.
Yeah, so maybe there's some comfort in that.
We're all going to hell together.
Woo!
All aboard the gravy train.
Okay, great. And on that note, do we want to do one more question, or do we feel like this is a good time to wrap it up?
I think we're good.
Yeah, I think we're good. I think it's a good point to end, actually, on a high note. So this was our episode on solving the meaning crisis. Thank you for coming on this journey with us. I think we had a lot of fun, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Like, subscribe, check out our Patreon, leave us a review, and do all that if you like this content, and take care.
Thank you for joining us on the Multiversity. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversitypodcast.com.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.